Ton, would you like to do the introductions?
Hi everyone, this is Sephardic World brought to you by the Sephardic Genealogical Society. As always, we welcome our patrons who are with us here on Zoom. They support us and they make all of these weekly meetings possible. And welcome to our viewers on YouTube. This week's speaker, Simon Kreindler, will tell the story of the Barbados Sephardic community and discuss some of its fascinating members. Simon wrote 2 books about Jews in Barbados, Peddlers All, Stories of the First Ashkenazi Jewish Settlers in Barbados, which is a compilation of the stories of 40 Ashkenazi Jewish families who managed to escape Europe before World War II. And in 2022, he published the Sephardi Jews of Barbados. And of course, that book will be discussed in this meeting. Simon was born and grew up in Barbados. He studied at McGill University in Montreal and graduated from McGill's medical school in 1965. Following that, he trained in adult and child psychiatry in the US in 1971. But he returned to Canada and was in private practice in Toronto until his retirement in 2019. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, everyone, and thank you, David and Ton, for giving me this opportunity to share the story with you. When I was growing up in Barbados in the 1940s, there was an old building in Bridgetown, which is the capital city, that I was told had once been a Sephardic synagogue. This is the building you see here. There was nothing distinctive about it, and as a youngster, I only remember it looking pretty shabby and run down. This is what the building looked like in the 1920s, even before I came into this world. And this is what it looked like in the 1930s after it had been sold and converted to offices. I'll come back to talking about it more later, but first I want to tell you about how I got interested in learning about the island's Sephardi community. As Ton just said, in 2017, I compiled a book about the stories of the approximately 40 Ashkenazi families who had managed to get out of Europe before the war and make it to Barbados. These stories were written by my contemporaries and myself, and by us, the children of that generation, who had had a very different experience growing up on an island paradise like Barbados was. One of the authors who had contributed to the book had written an introduction that included information about the old synagogue, the old Sephardi synagogue, and it started me wondering who these Sephardim were that had built it, where they had come from, and what had made them choose to come to Barbados. Okay, so for the answers, we need to back up a few hundred years. Most of you know that during the Spanish Inquisition, Ferdinand and Isabella expelled that country's 200,000 Jews, hoping to make Spain uniformly Christian. If the Jews didn't leave, they had to convert or face death. The expulsion created a large group of conversos, men and women, who outwardly professed to be Catholic while continuing to practice their Judaism secretly. In the subsequent Portuguese Inquisition, that country's king, Manuel, didn't expel the Jews because he recognized their financial smarts could be an asset to him. Instead, he forced them to convert or else face death. The existing converso population expanded significantly. In 1500, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Cabral discovered Brazil, over here. And in 1502, Manuel gave a consortium of Jewish merchants a lease to explore and settle the new country. Each year, the consortium sent ships to Brazil with colonists and supplies. It also sent foremen and engineers with experience in growing sugarcane and manufacturing sugar to work on the country's sugar plantations. Some of these men were the same conversos previously mentioned who had escaped the Inquisition on the mainland and developed expertise in growing and manufacturing sugar on Portugal's Atlantic colonies, the Azores, Madeira, the Azores, Madeira, the Cape Verde Islands, and Sao Tome, just north of the equator over here. Sugar production in Brazil grew rapidly, and in 1550 there were 5 sugar mills operating, and by 1600 there were 120 of them. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was established. In 1624, the Dutch West India Company tried to conquer Brazil, but was defeated by the Portuguese Navy. In 1630, it tried again, and this time was successful. Conversos living in Brazil celebrated, relieved their double lives were finally over, and they no longer needed to pretend they were Catholic. Sephardi Jews took over supplying Europe with sugar, and with their family networks and wide-ranging business contacts, soon established a monopoly. Within a short time, Brazil became the world's richest sugar-producing country. Sugar brought hundreds of Sephardim from Amsterdam to Brazil, and simultaneously, the West India Company brought thousands of Black African slaves to work on its plantations. This picture shows a slave market. It's hard to see, but these are all Black slaves in the slave market in Recife. By 1639, 2 Jewish congregations had been established there, the Zur Israel congregation in Recife and the Magen Abraham in nearby Mauricia. In 1641, 2 of Amsterdam's most illustrious rabbis, Isaac Abobab de Fonseca and Moses Raphael de Aguilar, arrived in Brazil to serve the 2 communities, and public Jewish worship in the New World took place for the very first time. By 1650, the 1,500 Jews living in Recife exceeded the 1,200 Jews living in Amsterdam. Abraham de Mercado was a converso physician, and his son, David Raphael, they were among the early Sephardim to arrive in Recife from Amsterdam, and I will return to talking about them again shortly. Abraham is believed to have been the first Jewish physician in the New World, and he subsequently became head of Recife's Jewish community. Now I want to back up slightly and bring Barbados into the story. Oops. Spanish and Portuguese explorers knew about Barbados as early as 1508, and we believe the Portuguese visited the island at some point, but for whatever reason, never claimed it. But they left pigs in the event they were ever to return, and those pigs multiplied in the years that followed. The British claimed Barbados in 1625, and the first British ship, the 70 English settlers, arrived in 1627. The settlers didn't have it easy. Initially, they lived in caves, foraged for food, and cleared the dense forest so they could plant food crops and the tobacco and cotton that they would later export. The only thing there was an abundance of was pork from the pigs the Portuguese had previously set free. We don't know exactly when sugar first arrived on the island. Some believe it was in 1637, and others say it was earlier, but everyone agrees it came from Brazil. Whenever it arrived, we know the first recorded shipment of sugar to England was in 1643, and it rapidly replaced cotton and tobacco as the preferred crop of the early settlers. Given that settlement was in 1627, it seems remarkable that within only 16 years, the forests had been cleared and sugar was being produced in sufficient quantity to be exported. Because growing and harvesting sugar is very labor intensive, white workers were initially brought in from England and Ireland to do the work. In return for 5 to 7 years of service, these so-called indentured servants were given food, clothing, and passage to the island by the plantation owners who employed them. They were also promised a small plot of land when their indenture was completed, although the majority never saw that promise fulfilled, as all the land had by then been distributed to the planters. As sugar production grew, so too did the need for additional labor, and with the cost of indentured servants constantly increasing, the planters started searching for other options. Ultimately, the Dutch West India Company stepped in, and like it had done in Brazil, brought in black slaves from West Africa. More than 200,000 were transported to the West Indies between 1640 and 1700, and Barbados took half of them. So let me back up a few years and bring the Sephardim into the story. No one knows exactly when the first Sephardim arrived on the island. I suspect they were, or who they were, I should say, but I suspect they were the Dutch traders who timed their arrival with the arrival of that first ship of English settlers in 1627. As you know, the Sephardim were the networking geniuses of that era. Although they didn't have the internet, they had family and trading connections in most major cities. They usually knew which ships were arriving at and which were departing from those locations, would know what cargo the ship was carrying, the number of passengers, who the captain was, and so on. They probably knew when the settler ship left England and that it was headed to Barbados. They would have known that the trip would take 1 to 2 months, and that by the time it arrived, the remaining food on board would not be fit to eat. One can only imagine how delighted they must have been to be greeted by a ship or ships with fresh provisions. I very much doubt they would have cared who the owners of those ships were. I suspect the Sephardim probably had an idea of what the settlers intended to do on the island, and probably saw business opportunities in the making. Whether some of them set up outposts on the island at that time, at the same time as the settlers, is unknown, but records do indicate that there were Jews on the island as early as 1628. That was a year after the first English settlers arrived. In this detail, oh, sorry, I missed a slide. Excuse me, let me back up. By the late 1600s, the number of plantations on the island had grown to over 800. Further indication of just how rapidly the sugar industry was expanding. Because the planters controlled the government, they made a point of not permitting the Sephardim to own plantations, effectively forcing them to live in Bridgetown. This 1695 engraving illustrates what a busy place Bridgetown was at the time. If you counted the ships in Carlisle Bay, you would find that there were 30 to 40 of them. The earliest cluster of Sephardi homes we know of was near the so-called Jews' brick house in the west central part of the town, dating from the mid-1650s. Historical geographer Martin Bowden has referred to that cluster of homes as a possible proto-synagogue of the early Sephardi community. And the Jews' brick house is believed to have been the home of Abraham and David Raphael de Mercado, who came to the island from Recife in 1655. Abraham was only the second or third physician on the island and the only Jewish one, and was probably welcomed by the small Sephardi community. His son, David Raphael, was already a prosperous trader when he arrived, and he went on to even greater prosperity as a result of developing a new kind of sugar mill, which he sold not just in Barbados, but in the other Caribbean islands as well. Joseph Jesurin Mendes, who also went by the trade name Luis Diaz, was another important member of the early Sephardi community. He arrived from Amsterdam in 1655, accompanied by his father, wife, Yael, and their 6 children. A 7th child was born in Barbados later. Like the de Mercados, Jesurin Mendes had also spent time in Recife, and like them, had been a prominent member of the Zur Israel congregation there. He was said to have been the friend and protector of every Jew on the island, and his epitaph described him as God-fearing, beloved, and respected by all men in his time, clearly a man who was greatly admired. The Sephardi community must have grown quickly, given that by the early 1650s, it had purchased land in Bridgetown for a cemetery. Although the earliest burial we know of was in 1658, there may well have been earlier ones. We believe this because when the cemetery was restored in the early 2000s, many stones were found there that had been buried for years, and their inscriptions were no longer legible. In the early 1660s, Jesurin Mendes was prevailed on by his fellow Jews to found the Nideh Israel congregation, the scattered of Israel, to purchase land and to erect a synagogue. He is generally regarded as having been the leader of the congregation, and I suspect was probably tasked with overseeing construction of the synagogue, a project that probably got underway in the early 1660s and was likely not completed until about 1664. The 1664 completion date is about 10 years later than the Barbados Jewish community has traditionally claimed, but given that there was no organized Sephardi community on the island in 1654, and that Jesurin Mendes did not arrive on the island until 1655, the 1654 completion date that Barbados has claimed for the start of the synagogue seems doubtful. By 1680, the population of Bridgetown had grown to about 3,000, and 54 of the 404 homeowners were Jewish. Most were poor, but as Wilfred Samuel has told us, a spirit of religion and true piety prevailed, and the richer Jews assisted in bearing the burdens of their poorer brothers. In addition to the Bridgetown community, there was also a small cluster of wealthy Sephardim living in Speightstown, where the first settlers had landed. That was about 20 kilometers north of Bridgetown. The Speightstown Sephardim also built a synagogue, but it was destroyed in an anti-Semitic riot in 1739. In this detail from the previous slide, one can see the sugar plantations and the numerous Dutch-style windmills dotting the hillsides inland from the port of Bridgetown. At their height, there were more than 400 windmills on the island, another indication of just how rapidly sugar cultivation and processing was expanding. The buildings along the waterfront demonstrate a strong Dutch architectural influence. Sadly, all but one of these Dutch-style buildings were destroyed in a series of fires that ravaged Bridgetown in 1766. If you look at the waterfront carefully, you can see men going about their work. And you can also see the many wooden barrels, so-called hogsheads, that held between 800 and 1,500 pounds of sugar. After the fancy foods and wines imported by the well-to-do planters had been unloaded, sugar and molasses took their place for export to England. The wealthiest Sephardi traders built homes on Bridgetown's waterfront where they could see the comings and goings of their and their competitors' ships. The less well-to-do ones lived on Swan Street, where the land was damp, less desirable, and less expensive. Most of these Sephardim ran small retail businesses, and a few were involved in money lending. Many of the Swan Street buildings, which you see here, still survive, and most have similar layouts: a ground level, ideal for retailing, and a second and sometimes a third floor for the family. The Swan Street area was compact, just 3 or 4 blocks long, and it rapidly became overwhelmingly Jewish, which is the reason why the street also came to be known as Jew Street. The Sephardim living there undoubtedly appreciated the fact that it was only a couple of blocks from the synagogue, as they were observant and would walk to the synagogue on the Sabbath. This is a composite slide with 3 different images. Because the community maintained close ties with the parent Portuguese Jewish congregation in Amsterdam, and because Jesuren Mendes was no architect, I suspect he may have consulted with the Amsterdam community regarding the design of the synagogue he was planning to build. Is it even possible he may have been given some suggestions by Elias Bouwman, the Dutch architect who would later build the Amsterdam Synagogue, its magnificent Portuguese synagogue, which was built between 1671 and 1675. No one knows exactly what the original Nideh Israel synagogue in Bridgetown looked like, because there are no surviving representations of it, and it was destroyed in a hurricane in 1831. I took the liberty of creating an image for it that combined aspects of the synagogue and the current day Nideh Israel in Bridgetown. And that's this one in the middle. A banyu or mikveh sat right over here near the front entrance of the synagogue. And the complex included, in addition, houses for several members of the synagogue staff, the Chacham, the Chazan, the Shamash, and so on and so on. There was also a home there for the Banadira, who was the female attendant of the banyo. A school for the children was subsequently also added to the complex. The cemetery surrounded the synagogue on 3 sides, which is very unusual in Judaism, but probably had to do with the time and circumstances when the land for it was purchased. A stone wall enclosed the entire complex, provided for in the will of David Rafael de Mercado, who died in 1685 and whose beautiful grave marker in the cemetery is still an impressive must-see there. It is important to emphasize that the Nideh Israel congregation was a strictly observant one. Shabbat and all the holidays were celebrated. All male children were circumcised. A shoichet slaughtered meat for the community according to the laws of kashrut. The congregation did not accept intermarriage, and they would not convert anyone who was not white. I'll come back to that shortly. Even though many of the members were capable of leading services, the community supported a slate of salaried clergy brought in from Amsterdam and elsewhere. So this is a present-day reconstructed banyu or mikveh next to the synagogue's front entrance. And what it looked like originally is uncertain, but because the stones that enclose it now were recovered from the rubble that covered it when it was found in an archaeological dig in the 1980s, it's quite possible it may have looked something like this originally. This is the interior of the mikveh, which was clean, but is otherwise the same as it probably looked like in the 1600s. When they found it, when it was found, the water that was from an underground spring was crystal clear, just like it is today. Over the years, the Sephardi community was served by many members of clergy, but for reasons of time, I'll only mention a couple of them. In 1678, Jesurin Mendes requested the Amsterdam community send a replacement for Chacham Isaac Neto, who had moved on to become the Chacham in Suriname. Not long after, Chacham Eliyahu Lopez arrived with his family. A member of a converso family from Malaga in Spain, he later reconverted to Judaism in Amsterdam. Lopez was described as tall and to have got an impressive sight in his long flowing robes. He had 2 black attendants and a long list of responsibilities that included looking after the synagogue, the cemetery, the school, and the religious court, in addition to supervising circumcisions, marriages, and funerals. He also had to provide for widows, orphans, and the needy, take care of dowries for unmarried women, assist transients, ransom captives, direct charity to the Holy Land, and maintain relations with the local Barbados authorities and other religious groups. All of this while overseeing the day-to-day activities of the community. He spent 15 years on the island before moving on to become the Chacham in Curacao in 1693. Minutes of the governing body of the Nida Israel congregation include information about Chacham Lopez and many of the other rabbis who served the community. Some of them make for interesting reading, such as the details of the sexual dalliances of one Chacham Raphael Chaim Abindana, whose relationship with a black woman working in the synagogue compound, whom he impregnated during his wife's pregnancy, are described in considerable detail. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into this today, but any of you interested can probably find the details online. Perhaps the best known of all the Chachamim who served the community was Raphael Chaim Carrigal, who came to Barbados in 1777. He was born in about 1729 in Hebron, then part of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, was ordained a rabbi at 17, and spent most of his life working as a shaliach, visiting Jewish communities and congregations all over the world to raise money for yeshivas in the Holy Land. In 1777, he visited Newport, Rhode Island, before coming to Barbados, and while there was befriended by Ezra Stiles, a minister in Newport's Second Congregational Church. Stiles was anxious to learn about biblical sources and to have Carrigal teach him Hebrew, requests Carrigal was happy to comply with. In fact, it seems that before Carrigal left Newport, Stiles had developed sufficient competence in Hebrew that the 2 men were able to correspond in that language. When Carrigal came to Barbados in 1777, he intended to stay only briefly, but the community didn't have a Chacham at the time and was so taken with him that they prevailed on him to stay, and he did. Unfortunately, he died only a few months later and is buried in the Nida Israel cemetery. The inscription on his stone, shown here, like most of the others at the time, is in 3 languages: Hebrew, Portuguese, and English. Ezra Stiles went on to become the president of Yale College, and as a tribute to Carrigal, made Hebrew a compulsory course for the college's freshmen. He also commissioned this portrait of Carrigal that still hangs in the Yale University Library. Another interesting member of the Sephardi community was Abraham Rodriguez Brandon, who came to Barbados as a young man in the late 1700s. Because he was English, he was not prohibited from plantation or slave ownership, as was the case with the Dutch Sephardim. In fact, Brandon later became extremely wealthy, owning 3 plantations and 168 slaves. He was also very involved with the Nida Israel congregation and at one time served as its president. What is most fascinating about him, however, is the story of 2 of his children, Sarah and Isaac Rodriguez Brandon, the product of his relationship with a mulatto slave owned by his friend Hannah Esther Lopez. Author Laura Liebman's book about the 2 children, entitled Once We Were Slaves, describes the brother and sister's conversion to Judaism in Suriname, because the Nida Israel congregation would not convert mulattoes, and their subsequent passage into Jewish high society in New York, where they married siblings who were members of the prominent Moses family. That book is a great read, by the way. In this 1766 map of Bridgetown, the synagogue in Israel can be seen here, and below it, Swan Street. Whoops, sorry. And Swan Street was where most of the Sephardim lived and had their businesses, apart from the wealthy ones who had their homes on the waterfront. From the early 1700s, the government's punitive taxation and anti-Semitic attitude caused many of the Sephardim to start emigrating. A series of fires in 1766 consumed most of commercial Bridgetown. All this unshaded area was destroyed in those fires. These fires were followed by droughts and infestations of sugar ants that drastically impacted sugar production and the island's overall economy. Huge tax increases followed in 1780, and the hurricane in October of that year spelled the beginning of the end of the Sephardi community. The most prosperous members began leaving for London, Amsterdam, and New York, and by the early 1800s, the size of the community had declined dramatically. A massive hurricane in 1831 ravaged the island and so severely damaged the synagogue, it was deemed impractical to repair it. Curiously, even though the community had been rapidly shrinking, the remaining members decided to rebuild it. Why this decision was made remains unclear. The rebuilding was completed 2 years later in 1833, and over 300 people attended the synagogue's rededication. Of the 300, however, less than a third of them were members of the congregation. Most of them were just invited visitors and members of the government and so on. In 1841, the decision was made to hand over the congregation's funds to the trustees of the parent Bevismark Synagogue in London. Emigration and assimilation continued, and by the late 1800s, Jewish burials in the Nida Israel Cemetery had almost entirely ceased, replaced instead by burials in Westbury Cemetery, the island's principal Christian cemetery. By 1848, only 71 Jews remained, and by 1869, there were only 8 contributing members. By the turn of the 20th century, the impact of the hurricane and new opportunities in North America and Europe resulted in even further decline. In the late 1880s, the brothers Joshua and Edmund Baeza came to Barbados from Suriname and joined the tiny Sephardi community. They opened a business, Bon Marché, seen here, on the island's main shopping street in Bridgetown, selling dry goods. They eventually closed the business in 1950, but both of them went on to careers in island politics and to serve on the boards of several of the island's major corporations. By 1924, they were the only remaining Sephardim on the island, excuse me, and their families had become totally assimilated. Joshua died in 1925, and by the late 1920s, Edmund was the last surviving member of the community. All the Nida Israel's religious property had by then been sent to Bevis Marks in London for safekeeping, and they had given Edmund, Bevis Marks, had given Edmund power of attorney to dispose of the synagogue building. However, Edmund was specifically instructed that the graveyard was not to be included in any sale, nor was it to be disturbed in any way by a new owner. Unfortunately, neither he nor the eventual purchaser honored the prohibition when the sale was completed in 1929. The purchaser converted the building to the office building I showed you earlier. The women's balcony was removed and replaced by a second floor. New windows were added, a driveway was built over part of the cemetery, and a garage was installed next to the building. In the process, significant damage was done to the graveyard and to the markers. In June 1934, Edmund died, and like his brother, was buried in Westbury Cemetery. His passing brought the 300-year Sephardi history of the island to an end. Ironically, the first Ashkenazi Jews had arrived on the island in April 32, 2 years before Edmund died. I have searched, but have never been able to find or heard anything to indicate that any of the Ashkenazim had ever met or knew Edmund. The approximately 40 Ashkenazi families who came to the island went on to build a small but vibrant community of their own. They initially davened in the home of one of their members, and in the 1960s purchased a bungalow that they converted to a shul. In the 1980s, the Barbados government announced plans to demolish the old building, the old synagogue building, to make way for a new Supreme Court building. The Ashkenazi community protested and were eventually successful in getting government to abandon the plan. In return, they agreed to restore the synagogue and the cemetery. And this is the restored complex, now part of a much larger UNESCO World Heritage Site managed by the Barbados, and this part of it is managed by the Barbados National Trust. It is used for Friday night services during the tourist season, as well as for destination weddings, bar mitzvahs, and bat mitzvahs. The current Barbados Jewish community is made up of a handful of the children and grandchildren of the Ashkenazim who arrived before World War II, a few regular winter visitors from the UK and the USA, some new immigrants, and a small number of Black converts or prospective converts. For the past 4 or 5 years, the island has also been home to a Chabad rabbi and his family. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. That was excellent and fascinating. And I should say we've been looking for somebody to speak on Barbados for about 3 years since we started. So we're grateful to you. We have a slightly larger audience than usual, including on YouTube. So it's a shared wish. Can I just add two comments? First of all, you said that the property of the community had been returned or sent to the Spanish and Portuguese Jews Congregation of London. This included much of the surviving archives, including sort of birth, marriage, and burial records. And these are now in the London Metropolitan Archives and can be viewed with permission of the archivist of the Spanish and Portuguese congregation. And the second point in London is the Barbados community is absolutely famous for always having disputes with each other and appealing to the London community for each side that they should be supported. So it's absolutely fascinating, a fascinating community. I actually sometimes wonder whether the Jews from Brazil arrived in Barbados before England, and whether actually Barbados and its sugar was one of the things that maybe has swayed Cromwell. But of course, I could be very mistaken. Ton, do you have some things to say or some questions?
I do think that the Sephardim started to arrive after they left Brazil. Personally, I know of one person, Moses Cohen Henriquez, who must have gone from Barbados, from Brazil straight to Barbados. For in 1656, he asked from Barbados to Amsterdam for a Sefer Torah on parchment that had belonged to his father Abraham. So there will have been more like him. I see in chat that Ron Gomez Caceres has a question. Ron, could you share it with
I
us?
I didn't have a question. I tried to answer a question that somebody else asked, which was how the Bed-Din functioned in Barbados.
How they functioned. Not sure what exactly you mean, Ron.
What was there a local Beth Din, or did they refer questions to London, I guess is the question.
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Mm.
Actually, the London Beth Din records don't survive either, so we may never know that.
The comment I made was that in Curacao, Curaçao's community reverted to the Amsterdam Bed-Din when there were questions to be adjudicated by a Bed-Din, and just the reason that might have happened with London and Barbados.
Yeah, I suppose that's quite possible. Not sure.
And
Melissa on YouTube, there's a typo in your question. Could you retype that, please?
and Ron Gomez, no, not Boris Kahan had a question. Please.
Yeah, Simon, thanks for this, multi-century view. I am always curious how Jews who owned slaves celebrated Pesach, and whether that's too much of a modern view of the whole thing versus being in the moment there. Was there any awareness of that dichotomy, perhaps?
I suspect they were probably very much aware of it, but it happened anyway. They owned slaves anyway. The vast majority of them were only permitted to own a single slave, except for people like Rodriguez Brandon, who, because he was English, was not restricted in the number of slaves that he could own. But there were some who owned more than one slave. But the Barbados government and the planters basically tried to limit all the others to only owning one.
Well,
Anyway.
and you described the Dutch West Indies company as being either a purveyor of or a transport mechanism for the slave trade.
Yeah, that has been the subject of a great deal of debate over the years. Yes.
Catherine Copisaro has a question. Please, could you share it with us?
Yes, hello. Really, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, a really interesting talk. Thank you very much. And I've actually read your book, and particularly brilliant from my point of view is the list of sources and bibliography. Really helpful. Thank you. I'm interested in the Castello family, Nunez Castello. There are a smattering of them, which I'm not sure how to find records from the 1600s and 1700s, and wondered if there are particular places in Barbados where the records haven't come to London, as David mentioned, that still exist there that I should be looking for.
I don't believe that you will find any of them, of any consequence in Barbados. I think they're mostly been sent to England. And I know that there's a very well-known Barbados researcher who has researched the records of the synagogue and its various deliberations on various subjects in London. I think there are probably some records in Amsterdam, but I suspect most of them are in London.
Thank you.
Bernard.
First of all, thank you for a fascinating talk, which opens up a whole lot more things that need researching. I have two questions. One is general and the other is specific. The general one is you talked about the community, although it had the capability of running and conducting services for itself, it wanted to have a rabbi, and you talked about the different people who came from, well, you talked about Amsterdam, but also about others. And I wondered whether or not you have any knowledge of how that compared with other communities at the same time. Is it because the community in Barbados was relatively wealthy and could afford it, or was it something that other Caribbean Sephardic communities were also very keen to do, even if it was a struggle to pay them? That was the one question. The other question is very specific. You talked about the dalliances of one Hacham Abendana, which I've been trying to look up while you were talking, since I've got a lot of Abendanas in my family. And I have to share this with you. On the World Jewish Congress site, somebody has posted this, which I must read. It said, I think my great-grandmother Sarah Abendana, who married Michael Hart in London, was born in Barbados to Raphael Abendana, a one-time Sephardi hazard. I presume hazard was a typo, unless she's referring to the dalliances, but whether she meant Chazan or Hacham, I'm not sure. But the question was whether or not Raphael was the dallying Abendana, or whether Joseph was, or whether it was a different one, just to help me do some research on them. Thanks again.
You're very welcome. I don't know, that it was the one name that I have associated with the dalliances was this particular name. But I don't know how, I don't know enough about the genealogy of his family to know who these others were. And okay. You asked an original question before that, and sorry, it's gone out of my head at the moment.
It was about the determination of the community to have a rabbi, which meant shipping one in, and whether or not it was because they were relatively wealthy, they could afford it, or whether it was a struggle to pay for that, and how that compared with other Caribbean communities.
The only community I think you can probably compare the one in Barbados to at that time would have been the one in Curacao that Ron can probably tell you much more about. But I suspect in the early years, it was because they were wealthy and could afford it. But as time was going on, they began emigrating. And so it became less and less of an issue, I suspect, to afford to bring in these people from outside. And I think at the end, they were basically their own people were conducting the services. That I know.
Thank you.
Adrian Zanet has her hand up.
You're muted.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Rodriguez Brandon had a sister, Esther, and I was wondering if you're familiar at all with her fate. She married Hazan Daniel Cohen de Azevedo, and when he left London, the story might be that he went to Barbados. Is there any record that you can find about that?
That name is familiar from Barbados, but whether he is the same person that was married to her, I do not know.
Okay, well, we're trying to find out where Esther and Daniel went after they left Bevis Marks in 1802. And I was hoping maybe you could direct me to do some research myself.
I don't recall coming across anyone who came to the community from Bevis Marks.
Okay, well, that's probably why I can't find them. Thank you.
David Silvera.
Well, we've had a little discussion on the question of whether the Jews there were wealthy or poor. There may have been some wealthy ones, but rest assured, we know at least one poor, and I know we're going to find some more. In 1539, at the Church Lane Synagogue, which is 1679, which predates Bevis Marks by some 25 years, the record of the synagogue shows that they gave money to Jacob Senior and his nephew to go to Barbados. And this is one of the early records that we've found in reviewing the Church Lane Synagogue account books. One of the early, there are others, being dispatchers being given money to go somewhere else. Presumably, they were given money because they couldn't make a living in London, and they were therefore likely to be quite poor. So there were at least some poor Jews coming to Barbados. That's all.
Thank you, David. Lola Langer in chat also had a question. Could you please go over once again the Ezra Stiles connection with Barbados? Because Ezra Stiles was her college at Yale, but she had no idea that there was a Sephardic Barbados connection to him.
Ezra Stiles didn't really have any direct connection with Barbados. He was in Newport, and he was connected through Newport with, blocked on his name at the moment, Cargill, who came there before coming to Barbados. And that was, that was before Cargill even came to Barbados. So Stiles didn't really have any direct connection, as far as I know, with Barbados.
Susan Lockwood in chat asks, are there any surviving graves from the Sephardi burials of the 1700s?
Any surviving records?
Gravestones.
Gravestones. Oh, yeah. There are lots of gravestones in that cemetery. I mean, some of them that were unearthed in the early 2000s in the process of restoring the cemetery. You can't read any of the inscriptions on them, but there are lots of early gravestones there that can be read, and there are many of them that are quite beautiful.
From the 1700s?
Hmm?
From the 1700s?
Yeah.
But
Can I just add a point to that? Evan Milner, who was the person who was working on the cemetery, he actually used to attend Bevis Marks. He's not in the UK at the moment. He told me that he has his own notes, which hopefully in due course we can get hold of and share with the group.
I don't want to, I'm not in the business of publicizing the book, but one of the appendices at the end of the book is an appendix having to do with Evan de Milner, and the stones that he rearranged in the correct order there after the damage was done to the cemetery. So you might, be able to access some of the 1700 stones there in that listing that he has. They all come, of course, with Hebrew dates, but you can find ways of translating those relatively easily.
Excellent, thank you. And just a reminder that you can get Simon's book on Amazon and other retailers. Can we quickly, Tom? Can we just quickly go to YouTube? I'd first of all like to welcome Luca and Kevin. Kevin, I hope you're feeling better. Luca asked about is there any existing list of Jews from Barbados in the 17th and 18th centuries? We've discussed the London, the synagogue records now in London. Are there records also in Barbados? I don't know, maybe sort of census or property records or something like that.
I don't believe there are very many of those, if there are.
Okay, and we also have a question from Melissa. I have a family member, Sarah Burgos, died in 1740. I haven't found any family record of hers. I found the Burgos name in the cemetery records. Would they have been related?
No idea. Sorry.
Does anybody else have any knowledge or thoughts on the Burgos family?
Maybe in the Shellstone book about epitaphs from Barbados. It's from the 1950s, I think.
Yeah.
It must be available in a library somewhere near you.
I'm sure.
There's a possibility that there might be a grave in that book.
Great. Seth, you have your hand up.
Hi, thank you. Just a comment. I know that Adrian Gennett was asking about someone who may have come from Britain to Barbados in 1802. Just to give a place you might want to look, by that time, there are some ship transport records in the British National Archives at Kew of passengers on board ships. And if you narrow down a year and start looking through those records, Barbados was a major centralized hub connecting to all of the British West Indies. So many ships came from Britain to Barbados and then went to other islands. You may be able to piece together some transit records in that way. And also to add, the person who just asked about census data, I'm based in New York, and I know that the American Jewish Historical Society has a copy of the 1680 census of Bridgetown, where it mentions all of the Jewish residents of Bridgetown in 1680. And I don't remember the exact date, but I think there was another census done roughly 1730 or so that should be accessible in places that might not be in synagogue records, but in more secular and governmental archives.
Thank you. That's incredibly useful. Thank you.
By the 1800s, I think most of the people were going the other way. They weren't coming from Britain to Barbados. Most of them were going, the Jewish ones anyway, were going the other way.
So we actually have an Ashkenazi question on YouTube. Was there? Oh, sorry, it's asking about a Jewish family in Prague. Sorry, I thought Jewish family from Prague. So I apologize, that's not relevant. But Bernard, you have your hand up again.
Yeah, it's not a question, it's a request. But I remember talking to Evan Milner about the Barbados Cemetery a couple of years ago, and I think he's a first cousin of Frances Rifkin, who's not here tonight because it was at her house. And he said he's got a lot of photographs, but also I think he's probably very well informed on the sort of mix within the cemetery. And I wondered whether it would be possible to invite him to speak at some point. I think he's currently living in Greece, but I don't think that's any impediment to people speaking.
That's correct. Yeah. Yeah, we can try. Yeah.
I think we don't have any questions anymore. maybe on YouTube.
No, I think we've asked all the questions.
Yes. Then maybe that's the time to wrap it up. As always, we thank our patrons who will make all of this possible. And we thank our viewers on YouTube. But above all, we thank Simon Kreindler for his excellent presentation. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you.
Next week, we will celebrate 3 years of Sephardic World. Yes, we are already here for 3 years, and it looks more like 3 months to me.
21 years and cat years.
Yeah. We don't know yet which form it will take, but I hope you will all be here. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Simon, again.
Thank you all.
Thank you. It was excellent talk. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.